So that's lifting up the language of English. So I'm still talking English, but not lifting it up with this huge beam of light, but lifting it up bit by bit as I'm using English, being a good, godly person in a mundane world. We are in the middle of language and understanding the concept of the godliness embedded in language. But since we're also in the weeks when we have every week the energy from Ethics of the Fathers, I wanted to bring in a little bit of that first. We're going to do one or two from yesterday, which was chapter 4. Concepts that are relevant to us. And then we'll jump to this discussion on language, the energy embedded in language, and practically speaking, what we're supposed to do about that. Highlight 2 ideas, both so relevant and practical. There's always an accounting going on in our life. Well, of course, you know that. But the term for it is very questionable if we think about it. The term in Hebrew for no, there's an accounting. No, someone's watching. No, whatever you do is measured and weighed, is 2 Hebrew words. Din, and then the word cheshbon. Din means a judgment, and cheshbon means a calculation. So there's a judgment and calculation. Keep that in mind to stay holy and godly, because God's, someone's watching, and there's a calculation for everything you do. So the question on that is, we get that, but why is it a judgment and a calculation? It's not a judgment and then a calculation. There's a calculation which creates a judgment. So the Hebrew word should have been calculation and judgment. No, there's a watch. No, everything's being recorded, remembered, calculated, and ultimately judged. Why does it say the opposite? A judgment and a calculation. And the idea behind this is because very often, first, there's a judgment, and then based on that judgment, there's a calculation. The judgment is the judgment how we judge others. Sometimes, instead of the heavenly courts judging us, we're shown someone else doing something very similar to what we did wrong. And we pass judgment because we're so quick to pass judgment on others. And based on the judgment we pass, there's a calculation. What should come to us? How does that reflect with what we did wrong? How does that reflect with what should be happening in our life? So from our judgment of others in a similar situation comes the calculation in the heavenly courts, what should happen to us? So I wanted to share that, and I know I've shared the idea before, but here is it written in the Ethics of the Fathers, because it's such a powerful thought as we freely, easily, without qualms, pass judgment on people all day long. Oh, whatever. We know how we judge, and we judge, and we judge fast. If we stop and say, wait a minute, maybe I'm being shown this, so I have an opportunity to pass judgment on myself. Maybe that's why I'm seeing this. We might make far more beneficent, kind in our judgments of others if we know it's really a judgment on ourselves. So I always think that's an incredibly powerful concept, incredibly relevant and powerful, and we should remember it and act different because of it. That's one idea from Ethics of the Fathers, from chapter 4, which was the chapter of yesterday, the Sabbath, which blesses this entire week, so it continues into this whole week. Another thought from Ethics of the Fathers that I also think is very powerful and relevant is more philosophical. Philosophically, in this chapter, it discusses how 1 hour of good deed in this world is better than a lifetime in the world to come, than a lifetime of reward. And that's also like, what are the sages saying there? That 1 hour of good deeds in this world is better than a lifetime of reward for all of our good deeds. That's like, well, that doesn't sound like very good reward. If 1 hour of work is better than a lifetime reward, I don't think this is really the reward I'm wanting and expecting, and I don't know what God's doing here about his reward. What does that mean? So there's many levels of meaning, but just to give the foundational one upon which is built many others, this world is where we can give to God. The world to come, meaning the afterlife, meaning after a person passes away, their soul has what's called the Garden of Eden, a reward, feeling all the good it accrued and created in a lifetime here. That's good. That's fine. That's wonderful. That's reward. That's our benefit. But what we're doing here is God's benefit. When we work here, when we give to God here, when we sacrifice and prioritize God here, that's helping God. And when we're in the afterlife, it's good. It's great. It's amazing. It's reward. That's helping us. So 1 hour of working here and helping God is far more powerful. We're giving to God. We're helping God far better than a lifetime, than an eternity of the reward that just is to help me, to feed me. Similarly, slightly different understanding, but very similar point. In this world, when we serve, we're connecting to God himself. Only place in all of creation you can connect to God himself is a human being serving God in this world. All of the supernal beings and angels and celestial levels above not get God directly. If they did, they would feel it and they would cease to exist. They were completely subsumed in God's energy. We can get God because we don't feel a thing. So we can serve, we can connect to God's essence and being, and we can be completely oblivious, which is why we can get it. So therefore, in this world, when we are serving, when we are giving to God, when we are helping God, we actually get God himself. And in the next world, in the reward world, in the afterlife world, in the great waiting room, waiting for the redemption to come so you can come back world, there, it's all about reward. It's just my pleasure. And then it's just revelations of godly energy. It's not God himself. It's revelations of his energy. And that's a lot less. It's reward. Why is it reward? It's reward because I feel it, because I experience it, because it's pleasurable. This world right now, we're serving God. We're studying his Torah. That's a great service. And we don't feel a thing. In the next world, we're not going to be connecting to God. We're not going to be one with God. But whatever we're getting, we're going to, and that's why this world is better, because here you get God himself. And the next world is reward, because there you actually experience and feel a far smaller globe, but you're actually feeling it. And that's what we call reward, when we can feel it, when we can experience it. So again, I thought that was just a very powerful concept in terms of really understanding the enormity of what we can do in this world. We are capable of giving God. What we're doing is for him. What we're doing helps him. When we serve him, we and he are one. Nothing in all of creation is one with God himself, except when we're serving him. So it's huge what we're accomplishing. It's huge, our service. And the afterlife, it'll be reward. It'll be good. But here it's huge. Here it's about God. It's about God's need, and it's about us connecting to God himself. That was a second thought that I thought was very powerful and relevant from Ethics of the Fathers. And there are many others, but I just wanted to give something. And now we'll go back to what we're officially talking about, which is language and how with language we serve God. Before I do that, anyone had any reflections on either of these ideas raised? The idea of judgment and then calculation, because as we judge others, that becomes a calculation for our own heavenly judgment. And the idea of this world being better because we're giving to God, because we're connecting to God himself. The next world is the reward, but this world is actually better because here we give, here we serve, here we connect to God himself. Anyone have any thoughts, reflections, or questions on any of those ideas?
I have a question. It might seem really basic, and I apologize. When you're talking about serving God, are we talking about like strictly the mitzvot, or are we talking about this is like community service or making food for a neighbor? Are those
the commandments? Now, if a service of God is defined as a commandment, when you're doing a commandment, that's how you're connected to God himself. So if you're making food for a neighbor who can't make food for herself for whatever reason, obviously that's something God would want you to do. So it's very possible it falls under like the idea of, so there's 7 laws, right? Mm-hmm. 6 of which are like basically don't. And then the 7th, which is the positive commandment, is establishing the courts of justice. So within establishing courts of justice, there's also many subsidiary branches, including interpersonal behaviors and conduct and character traits, basically creating a civilized, nice, supportive world. So in my head, I think in there would go, I could see that little branch of making food for a neighbor who for some reason can't make food for themselves. So I'm pretty sure that would be under that. But if you would say like you're I don't know, your neighborhood is having a let's clean up the park party, and everyone goes and cleans up like a bag of garbage. I don't know if they do something like that. I just made that up. But if it was something like that, I don't know. I don't know if it would also fall under that idea of helping create a civilized, humane world, or if that's like already too far removed. Again, God wants you to create a beautiful world. So we always can say, is what this what God would want from me? Yeah. He wants me to make him a good world. This is part of creating a good world. He wants it.
Mm-hmm.
But that connection to God and giving to God is within the commandments. But again, as I'm saying, those 7 commandments are 7 overarching concepts within which there are many, many details.
Gotcha.
Absolutely. Very good question. Very foundational and very good to know. Let's go back to what we were talking about, that we last week had a question that took up the class. So it's been 2 weeks. We're talking about languages and refining the languages of the world and using the languages of the world to serve God. So we got a little bit of a historical perspective on languages, and we were sort of in the middle, and it's been a while. So I'm going to overview what we're discussing here. So there's 2 elements in terms of refining languages. There's the idea of, and this is always the 2 perspectives in serving God, from above to below, like drawing down such a great light, or from below to above, which is sort of like our work, like, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, our work, our efforts, our toil that creates a shift. So above to below sort of mean like God's energy comes down, big bang. Whoa, huge light that causes a change. Or below to above means, a little work and a little work and a little work, and we're polishing and we're polishing and we're polishing and we're refining and we're shifting, and then there's a huge change from the dint of a lot of effort. Those are the 2 basic perspectives. When God gives us the Torah, and we have the ability of learning Torah and speaking Torah in the language of the country, in language, that's a huge light. That's the light of Torah. That's what we're doing right now. We're using our language called English, and we're talking in English about God, about serving God, about Torah. So we're taking this huge light of Torah and bringing it down into the English language. So we're really shifting the English language in a big way from above to below, as this huge light of Torah is coming down and being within English, because we're using English as a medium to study about God. That's the above to below energy. The below to above energy is when we use English and be a good person, lead a godly life, like Natalie was saying, and we're making food for our neighbor. We're thinking of a charity campaign that we want to give our hard-earned money to. We're talking about raising our children. We're living a life, normal human life. But in this normal human life, there's a God focus. And that's why this is the things we're talking about, and not what's trending on Netflix. We're talking about how we can help other people, how we can improve ourselves, how we can better create a better, more moral world for our children. So we're talking about physical things, but with this perspective of serving God in this physical world. So that's also lifting up English. But it's not lifting up English with this huge beam of light of Torah. It's lifting up English because we, step by step, day by day, word by word, godly people in a secular world. So we're doing a lot of secular things, but we're doing it with a God bent. We're doing it with a God perspective. We're doing it as people that are striving to be closer and closer in all the details in our life, and how we are, if we give someone a ride, or how we're talking to a bank teller, or if, all those little details, how a person connected to God behaves in all those details. So that's lifting up the language of English. So I'm still talking English, but not lifting it up with this huge beam of light, but lifting it up bit by bit, being a good, godly person in a mundane world. So those are the 2 techniques we have, and we have both of them, for how we actually change the fabric of language. Now, again, to understand this historically, originally, the world was created with a godly tongue, with a holy language, with biblical Hebrew. And everyone spoke biblical Hebrew, and they only spoke biblical Hebrew. And it took many, many generations, passed after Mankind started serving idols. They're still speaking biblical Hebrew as they serve idols. Past all the corruption that led to the flood, they're still speaking biblical Hebrew as they're doing all that corruption leading to the flood. Until, of course, as we know, there was Babylonia, Tower of Babel, where God broke apart mankind's rebellion against the God that saved their ancestors from the flood, that wiped out the rest of humanity. And the descendants of those saviors, the descendants of those people, those few people, basically survived mankind. And now their descendants are going and rebelling against God with perfect unity. And God said, well, they have unity. I like unity. Well, they're rebelling against me. Got to stop that. Let's scatter their languages. They won't be united anymore because they won't be able to communicate. And that's when we had the classical 70 languages of man. And until that point, all of mankind, even people that were completely rebelling against God, arch-villains. They're arch-villains, but they're all speaking biblical Hebrew. That's what they're all speaking. And it's very interesting because we today do not casually speak biblical Hebrew. Yes, there is a modern Israeli country, and they have a modern Hebrew language, which is called Ivrit, modern Hebrew. That is not biblical Hebrew. I mean, obviously it's related, but it's like if you ever had to read, like, I don't know, Chaucer's Tales, and you're like, well, I know this is sort of English, but it's not exactly English. And it's like, this is Hebrew and this is Hebrew, but it's not exactly the same. But biblical Hebrew, we're told we don't just talk. It's very holy. Maybe some people talk it on Sabbath, or people talk it when they're learning Torah, but otherwise, please pass the salt. No, we're not going to say that in biblical Hebrew. But the world did. For some 20 generations, the whole world spoke about godliness in biblical Hebrew, spoke about mundane things like salt in biblical Hebrew, and spoke about treason and rebellion against God and idolatry and immorality and lust and murder in biblical Hebrew, because that was the language we had. And the entire world, including villains, as they spoke that biblical Hebrew for that some 21st generations of mankind, they were uncovering and expressing the godly energy in everything. Every aspect of creation is vivified by a word, by the word that is its name in biblical Hebrew. Like this, we call it a cup. In biblical Hebrew, it's called a kais. Kais has 3 letters in a very specific order. So those 3 letters, in the order of those 3 letters, with the vowels of that word, all of that is expressing the divine life that's vivifying this. So in English, I call it a cup, I call it a glass. That's just an agreed upon word. It's just a label. So when we say cup, we all know what we're talking about. We say glass, we all know what we're talking about. It has no intrinsic relationship to this. It's just something that has become accepted. That's what language is. It's communication, but not biblical Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew is far deeper than communication. Biblical Hebrew is expressing the essence God energy that is keeping this existent. And that God energy is Kos, its name in biblical Hebrew. So it's a fascinating concept that all of our ancestors, all of your ancestors, from the beginning of creation for some 20 generations, all they knew was biblical Hebrew. And as they spoke godly things, nice things, mundane things, evil things, they were still constantly labeling things with the name that was its energy. It's God energy. And they knew that. And as they did it, they were revealing that God energy. And we can't do that today. What your ancestors did, I can't do today. Because after the rebellion with the tower that became Babel, the Babel of languages, after that rebellion, we fell. The whole world fell, and we can't do it anymore. We can talk biblical Hebrew, and we can't have the ability to uncover the energy life of items by using their word in biblical Hebrew. And actually, since we fell, biblical Hebrew is like a bit too holy for us. So it's like, who are we to use the tongue with which God created the world and speak about just regular things? Maybe only if we're talking about very holy things on a very holy time, like studying Torah, like the Sabbath. But for the first 20 generations, the whole world, including very non-holy people, they did it and they could do it. But we can't do it now. What do we have instead? We have man-made languages. We have the 70 languages. The original language, biblical Hebrew, is like compared to stones, organic, natural, the building block of the world. English or any other language, they're bricks. they're man-made. But within those bricks, there's also a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous power. And the question really is asked, what is the relation of biblical Hebrew, of this ultimate power that is expressing the God energy of everything? And when you use it, it's revealing the God energy of everything. What is that relationship, that stone? How does that relate to the bricks of German and French and English and Spanish and Dutch? What's the relationship? Not so clear. Varying opinion. On one hand, we could say that when God made this Babel, right? That's the word. In Hebrew, it's Bavel. That's the word in Torah, which in English became Babel, which we think of like that babble of sound, of noise, of confusion, of varying languages, because that's what was going on then. There was a babble of 70 different tongues that nobody knew besides the people speaking them. When God did, as he was mixing and blending and creating, in each language, he sprinkled some biblical Hebrew. Because a language has to have some divinity source. It has to have some true power. How else could it be a language we use? How could it be this form? So in every language, there's a little flavoring, a little spice, a few words that have fallen in that are actually intrinsic, organic to biblical Hebrew. How do we see this? Because in the Torah, in the scriptures, occasionally a word is used and we're like, what's that word? And the sages will say, oh, that's a word in this language, or that's a word in that language. And the question is, well, why is the Torah writing words that aren't biblical Hebrew? We're speaking about the power of biblical Hebrew, and this is the language of creation, and this is the language of mankind until the rebellion, and this is the language which reveals the essence, energy of everything. Why is the Torah choosing to use a word in some type of African language or some type of Aramaic language or something? Like, what's going on? So it could be that those words that we're saying are like in an African language or that's the biblical Hebrew that fell into that language. So again, when we have in Torah words like totafos or yagar sadusi or these various words that we're told from this language, that's from this language, that's from this language, it is from those languages, but it's the biblical Hebrew in those languages. Because how could anything be in Torah that's not biblical Hebrew? So what is that showing us? That's showing us the language we speak as well. Well, we're speaking English. Is there any English naturally in the Torah in its original, not translated form? Not that we know of. But it's another man-made language, which means it has to be another language that also has sprinkled in it this energy of biblical Hebrew. We don't know where. We don't know which word. We don't know. But it's there. And that gives our language a certain power. And that gives the ability, as I was saying initially, that when we use this language to serve God, both in that, well, we're going to study Torah in English, which is what we're doing right now, and we're bringing down God's light, or like Natalie was saying, when we're speaking about making a meal for somebody who's not well, when we're like lifting it up from the bottom. The reason why in either direction, above to below through Torah or below to above through living human lives in a good way, in a godly way, the reason why this shift can happen is because our language innately has a power, not of bricks, but of stones. Sprinkled in, it has this godly power. And that's how we're able to use it, serve God with it, and elevate it. That language itself becomes a vehicle for God. Also, along the same line, there's 24 books of, I guess people call the scriptures, the Old Testament. We call Tanakh, the Torah. The Torah is 5 books. And then we have Nevi'im, which means the prophets, and Ksuvim, which means the writings, all of which are divine, all of which are not from man's thoughts and man's words. So Torah, and then the Nevi'im, meaning the prophets, and the Ksuvim, meaning the writing, is a totality of 24 works. We find in some of these works other languages. Now, if it's the occasional word, like for example, in the book of Esther, we have scattered there a few Persian words. So we could say that's just like what we were discussing before about those words in the Torah itself, in the scriptures itself, the 5 books that are officially African or from some other language, but that's the biblical Hebrew in African. So similarly, if in the scroll of Esther we have these Persian words, scroll of Esther is holy, it's godly, it's scriptures, it must be this is the biblical Hebrew in this Persian language. And that's why it could be in the book of Esther. But then we have, like in the book of Daniel, where we have Aramaic, great chunks of Aramaic within the biblical Hebrew. We're like, wait, what's going on here? If it's a word, we could say, yeah, these are those words. Every language got a few. And these are the words that language got that are really the biblical Hebrew original building blocks of all language. But if it's sentences and paragraphs, it's more than words. So what's going on? So what's going on is, again, maybe you could say a lot of this is biblical Hebrew, or you could say it's Aramaic. It's a man-made language. It's not a brick. It's a brick. It's not a stone. It's a brick. But this brick became part of Torah. This brick became part of the scriptures to open up the possibility that we could take the bricks in our language and make them that holy. In other words, just like in the book of Daniel, we have one of the 70 languages, man-made languages, but it became elevated to be part of scriptures, part of Tanakh, part of the writings, one of the 24 books. That isn't just for those sentences in Aramaic in the book of Daniel. That's a prototype. That's paving a road for all of us, for all the man-made languages we speak, that they could become that holy as well. So why are we going into this? I thought this was fascinating. There's a lot of very fascinating details that this is all from a talk of the Rebbe that the Rebbe discussed. Like, for example, the Rebbe says, based on all this, what's going to happen when Mashiach comes? When we have the complete redemption, are we going to all go back to speaking biblical Hebrew? Well, that sort of would make sense because the world should go back to how it was originally before the primordial sin. And then for sure it was biblical Hebrew. But based on prophets, it seems like no. Obviously, there'll probably be some and some, and maybe there will be speaking biblical Hebrew, but we'll still use these languages as well. I thought that was fascinating. Why would I be speaking English when I could speak biblical Hebrew? Because I elevated English. I served God in English. I studied Torah in English. And I was a good human being that fulfilled the commandments, the mitzvot in English. So English changed. English has like my sweat in it. English has been the foil, been the tool for my expressing a relationship with God. So redemption comes and suddenly English is in the garbage. We've elevated it. We've made it a language we can talk by Mashiach. And so too with all the languages, as people have studied Torah in those languages and brought this enormous light down to the language, and people have served God in the language and brought the language up through their service, the languages have changed. And even though they started off as bricks, they've now ascended to becoming stones. They've ascended to becoming true foils for God's expression because we made them holy. They're like bricks. They're man-made. And they're saturated. They're drenched with our sweat. They're drenched with our efforts to serve God as we live our normal life. So I thought it's an amazing thing as you're living your life and you're speaking to your children, and you're speaking to colleagues, and you're speaking to friends, and you're speaking to family. And when we talk all day long, talking is communication. Whatever we got to do, we got to talk or type or write. We're changing the world around us. We're changing the language around us. The language around us is shifting to become a language that can be spoken in the days of redemption, in the days of Mashiach. Because that's the energy being invested in it by our service. The Rebbe continues in this theme and discussing really this idea of, again, going back and forth of like bringing God down, bringing the language up. And the Rebbe compares it to Purim and to Hanukkah. And we have in Purim the God energy coming down, and Hanukkah us pulling it up. But basically, this is I thought it was a really practical, I don't know if practical is the right word, I thought it was very relevant because we could think, whatever. I mean, there's times when we're going, it really goes back to Natalie's question. There's times when we officially serve God, right? Like we give charity, that's God's service. We honor our parents, that's God's service. We refrain from doing many things that God doesn't let. We dress modestly, that's God's service. We're not eating meat that wasn't properly slaughtered, that's God's service. But then there's life. And we could feel correctly that the high percentage of the time we live is on life. The high percentage of the time we live is not necessarily on studying Torah. Maybe for some people it is. It's not necessarily in officially doing a commandment. Sometimes it is, and for some people it is, and for some life situations it is. But it might feel like a lot of the time, a lot of your life is just spent living. But here we're being told, don't get fooled. Don't misunderstand what you're doing by living. As you live and serve God and express life as a godly person, talk as a godly person, communicate with others as a godly person, you're changing. What am I changing? You're changing the language itself. Language itself has changed because you're investing in it the energy of a godly person living. So I think maybe one of the takeaways from this, as you can reflect on your life, and I can reflect on mine, you can reflect on your speech, and I can reflect on mine, is really having that this focal, this sort of overarching sense of like, hey, I'm accomplishing something. It's not like, what did I do today? I lived. I paid bills. I found lost items. I did laundry. I made food and we ate the food and I cleaned up from the food. I don't know, we lived. Worked. I lived. Cleaned out my yard. I lived. Mowed the lawn. I lived. Sprinkled through that but it was living as a godly person. It was living as someone who's aware of God. It was living as someone who God is the centrifugal force of their life. Then all of those things are different. And the language used in doing all of those things is different. And that's, again, it's literally lifting up this language. So by Mashiach, by the redemption, people can speak English. They will speak English because English has become holy. It's become a godly tongue through man living as a godly being within the English language.